Welcome to Redcliffe Plantation State Historic Site. I'm Ranger Chelsea, and today we're going to go on a virtual Discover Carolina tour to find out what life was like for those who lived on a 19th century plantation like Redcliffe. We're going to examine how these people learned, ate, played, what their homes looked like. And first we're going to focus on the enslaved families who lived and worked on this land. And then we're going to look at the families who owned the land and who owned the enslaved individuals here.
Before we get started, let's get the lay of the land. Now would be a good time to grab your site maps. We are looking at the grounds from the northwest corner. This land was purchased in 1855 by James Henry Hammond and includes the two buildings on the left, which are actually two of the four remaining slave cabins. These were built by enslaved peoples in 1857. The largest structure on the land is the mansion, also built by enslaved peoples in 1859. There is also the building on the right, which are the stables. Those were built in the early 1900s. James Henry Hammond actually owned 4 plantations. Redcliffe was the last and smallest of those.
As we get started on our tour today, let's first answer the question of what is a plantation? Do you have any guesses? Take a minute and think about it. A plantation is a large farm or estate where crops are grown and cultivated. Do you know what the 5 cash crops of South Carolina are? Cotton, corn, indigo, tobacco, and rice. So on our tour today, we are going to learn a lot about those who actually did that work and labor of cultivation, of growing those crops, as well as the people who owned those crops and made money from them. Also today, we're going to be learning using primary sources. If you haven't learned what a primary source is, it's an artifact or old object, anything that was created during the time period that we're learning about and from which we can learn. So we're going to look at documents that are primary sources, objects that were dug up in the ground as primary sources. Even these buildings are primary sources because they were constructed in the 1850s, and that's the time period we're learning about. So let's head on inside.
We are now going to step inside this cabin, one of the original 4 slave cabins that existed here. Remember, you have a chart where you will label what the rooms were used for in the historic structures we toured today, both in the cabin and in the mansion. We are now inside the cabin. This one room was the entire home for the enslaved peoples that lived here. Anywhere from 2 to 10 people could have been living here at any given time. This was the bedroom, living room, kitchen, dining room, all in one space. There's not much furniture. The beds, sacks stuffed with hay, would have been directly on the floor. When you look around, you have to wonder if this felt like a home.
As we look further into the lives of the enslaved, those who lived in this structure, we're going to use a primary source. And that primary source is called the Plantation Manual. This was written by James Henry Hammond, and it's essentially the rule book for how the enslaved were allowed to live on his plantation. From here, we learn about the clothing that they were given, what they ate, what their workday looked like. But keep in mind, this was written by Hammond. It's from James Henry Hammond's point of view. When we look at the lives of the enslaved, we don't have written documents from their point of view. Because if you were enslaved, you were not allowed to read or write. Now, some people did break those rules and they taught themselves how to read or write. But it wasn't legal, it wasn't allowed, and that brought risk of punishment. So we're going to use this document and look a little bit further into their lives. The first thing we're going to talk about is food. What were the enslaved allowed to eat? What were they given? What did they grow to eat? But first, think about what you eat. Do you eat the same thing for breakfast every day? Maybe. Do you eat the same thing for breakfast and lunch and dinner? Every day? Every week? How often does your family cook at home? How often do you go out to eat? Think about those things, and we're going to compare it to what the enslaved peoples ate.
This is a page from the Plantation Manual that describes the daily food given to enslaved children. Try to read along with me. Allowance is given out daily to the children at the rates for each child of 1/3 of meal and meat given to work hands. An abundant supply of vegetables should be always at hand, and a garden cultivated for the especial purpose, to be cooked with their meat. Each child must have daily at least 1 pint of skimmed milk. Their food should be cooked by the nurse and consist for breakfast and supper of hominy and milk and cold cornbread. Their dinner of vegetable soup, usually pot liquor or okra soup, and dumplings or bread. Cold bread or potatoes should be kept on hand for occasional demands between meals. Their meat may be the same as that given to work hands, except that the only fresh meat allowed them is the beef bones for soup. They should have a little molasses once or twice a week and a well-roasted sweet potato every day. Each child is provided with a pan and spoon placed in charge of the nurse. So what was included in a daily meal for children? Skim milk, cold cornbread, vegetable soup, bread, dumplings, and sweet potatoes. Were any of your favorite foods on this list? What was missing from what you normally eat? Items such as coffee and sugar are considered luxury items and only given once a year at Christmas time. I have coffee every single day. How often do you have sugar? Once a year?
So we are now outside at a farm, and we're not at Redcliffe Plantation anymore, but we are on land that used to be owned by James Henry Hammond right down the road from Redcliffe Plantation. So thankfully our neighbor Jenks Farmer allowed us to come over and use the farm and the garden to talk about some of the crops. Do you remember what some of the crops were that were listed on that children's page? See if you can name them. There was sweet potato, corn, and okra. And remember also on that page, James Henry Hammond mentions that the enslaved were allowed to have gardens specifically for growing food to eat. Now James Henry Hammond had thousands of acres of vegetables and crops that the enslaved would cultivate to then sell that crop for him to make money off of. But the enslaved, when they had their gardens, they were not allowed to sell those vegetables to make any money. It was purely to eat the food. So we're going to look at a couple of those crops that the enslaved would have grown to eat. So we are standing next to some corn stalks, and this is a summer crop. So we're at the end of its season right now, so that's why it doesn't look as fresh as it would have maybe a month or two ago. But we're going to grab a piece of corn here off the plant, and then you might recognize it more as we shuck it and peel back these layers. But we know that James Henry Hammond had lots of corn grown. That was one of his main crops other than cotton. So the enslaved would have been cultivating this, and they would have had some of this to eat as well. So that's when we start seeing. Tear this back and you start seeing the kernels here. We're also going to take a look at when we have just the kernels dried out and how that would have been used for food as well.
These are kernels of corn from the cob, and these have been allowed to sit out and dry so that they can then be used for a few different recipes. For cornmeal, you would grind these kernels up until they almost look like sand. Then you could use that cornmeal to make cornbread. For hominy, you would soak and then cook the kernels. This is another vegetable mentioned in the Plantation Manual. Now we are at an okra plant here, and this was also eaten by the enslaved. So I'm gonna take just a little bit. This is just a tiny one. So they're kind of soft. When they're a little bit soft is when they're ready to be eaten. So we know that this would have been grown in gardens. And you use this plant to eat, but you can also use the seeds. So these are what, when you cut into an okra, you see the seeds, and as they get older, they darken a little bit as well. So they're kind of light now. This is what the inside of okra looks like. The seeds are pretty hard in okra and are often a darker color as the vegetable matures, but these are white because it is young. Now we are at some sweet potato plants, and the leaves are actually edible on this plant. This is also a summer growing crop, but you harvest it in the fall. And the longer you let it harvest and grow underground, because that's where the potatoes are, the bigger the potato will be, and then you'll have more food for winter. So this is kind of what we're used to seeing when we go and buy sweet potatoes in the store. But these have been growing a little bit longer, so I'm gonna dig one up. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. This is huge. And you can get potatoes this big if you let them harvest longer in the ground. So this is gonna give you a lot more food, obviously, than this. All right. The sweet potato on the left has been allowed to grow for much longer than the one on the right. Both are edible. This plant is not mentioned in the Plantation Manual, but we know that it has medicinal uses and may have been used by the enslaved peoples that lived here. It is called Verbascum thapsus, or a common name for it is mullein or Aaron's rod. This mullein plant grew very large and has dried out. It was, and still is, often used for coughs, bronchitis, congestion, and asthma, as well as for many other health issues. One of the ways it was used for medicine was by drying the leaves and using them in teas. Now let's take a look at what the workday looked like for the enslaved. What did they do each day? What did that primary work consist of? How much of the day did they have to work? Let's find out. This is another page from the Plantation Manual describing what the workday was. I'm just going to read some snippets from this page. The first horn is blown an hour before daylight. All work hands are required to rise and prepare their cooking for the day. At 12 noon, the gang stop to eat dinner. At 1 p.m., all hands return to work. In summer, the break increases with the heat to 3 hours. At sunset, hands knock off work for the day. The slaves are allowed to visit among themselves until the night horn is blown, after which no slave must be seen out of his house. So when did the Plantation Manual say that the workday started? Sunup. And when did the workday end? Sundown. And what was that primary work that was being done at Hammond's plantations? Well, it was picking cotton. So this is what that cotton plant looks like. And this cotton is what grows on the plant. Now imagine how much cotton would be picked throughout a single day when you're getting just this much maybe off of a single stem of the plant. This cotton bale weighs about 13 pounds. But you could see how much cotton it takes to equal 13 pounds. And this is a drag sack that would have been used by children and adults that had to be filled with cotton each day. So you see how long it is. This would have been worn over their shoulders and filled throughout the day. So this drag sack would fit several bales of this amount of cotton, 70 to 100, over 100 pounds,
would be filled in these drag sacks with cotton. Now let's look at another primary source, and we can see how much cotton would have been expected to be picked each day by children.
This document is from a list made by Hammond, and on it, he writes how much cotton some of the enslaved children picked in a single day. Take a second to look at it. Who picked the most amount of cotton? Little Rose. Who picked the least? Limerick. Who was the youngest child listed? Little Tom. This is another example of how primary sources teach us about the lives of people who lived back then. Another job performed by enslaved children was carrying water. This is a picture of a boy named Buren who lived at Redcliffe after slavery ended, and he's carrying water on his head. Water would have been carried throughout the day from wells to those enslaved working in the fields. A single bucket fit 2 to 3 gallons of water. 1 gallon weighs roughly 8 pounds.
So far, we've looked at what life was like for the enslaved children on this plantation. We've looked at housing, food, work, but what's something we haven't talked about yet? School. You'll remember I mentioned it was not allowed for enslaved people to learn how to read or write. Well, enslaved children were not allowed to go to school. Education was not provided for them. So as you think about day to day what you want to be when you grow up, where you want to go to college, what you want to do after you graduate from school, it's important to remember that enslaved children couldn't have these conversations. They weren't given the freedom to decide what they wanted to do or to get an education. So the enslaved peoples here, they made a life with what they had. They made memories, they had families, but the freedom to change those life circumstances wasn't available to them. Let's take a walk back out on the grounds and explore the rest of the site.